Did you know that chemicals, heavy metals, toxins, or chronic infections could be behind your chronic pain? That's what we're talking about today. This is Wellness by Design. I'm your host, Jane Hogan, the Wellness Engineer, and my guest today is Dr. Evan Hirsch. Evan Hirsch is a medical doctor and world renowned fatigue expert, best selling author, and speaker. He is the creator of the Energy MD method, the science backed and clinically proven 4-step process to resolving chronic fatigue syndrome, and long COVID naturally. In this episode, we talk about the 5 key toxins that are behind chronic pain and chronic fatigue, the symptoms of long COVID, and why your thoughts matter. We also talk about why you may need to add salt to your water. Enjoy the episode. Evan, welcome back. I'm so happy to be talking with you today.
Jane, good to see you. Thanks so much for having me on again.
You're like a returning champion. And you are all about something that I don't talk about very much when it comes to chronic pain. I talk a lot about emotions, and you, in the work that you do, you help people with things like toxins and, well, invaders in the body. So let's talk a little bit about that, and how do toxins play a role in creating chronic pain in the body?
So when we work backwards from pain, pain is inflammation. Inflammation is this catchword that everybody's talking about. But essentially what that is that's the immune system reacting to something. And you can work back from symptoms. So pain and dysfunction, any sort of symptom, is actually inflammation. And inflammation is the immune system reacting to something. So the question is, what is that something that the immune system is reacting to? And what I've found is that it's one or multiple of what I call the toxic five. So this is a combination of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction or trauma, which I know you're an expert in. And
Mm.
so all of those things each one of those toxins can actually cause nervous system dysfunction and consequently change the pain signals, increase the inflammation in the body, and then in turn cause pain.
Wow. As you said, like I deal a lot with nervous system dysfunction, but mostly for a lot of people that I work with, it tends to be more trauma kind of driven, whether it's big trauma or mild trauma. Um, but how would you know the difference? How would you know if the pain and then subsequent nervous system dysregulation is being caused by, chemicals or toxins or some kind of invader?
It's a great question. And oftentimes you really don't know until you get down the path a little bit. So I tell people that when it comes to their trauma, sometimes it's 10% of the issue and sometimes it's 90%. You know what I mean? So it really depends. And the same thing with the toxins. And so it's generally a total body burden. Like the more of these things that you have in the body, the more reactive the immune system
Yeah.
is, the more inflammation you have, the more pain and dysfunction you have. And so consequently, it's always a combination. The question is, how much of each of them is it?
Right, right. And so are there any ways that people would know that, or do you have to actually get into doing some testing to find out?
So there are some of these causes where we can determine based off of symptoms like infections that we can definitely go into, but some of them do require testing. The work that I do with chronic fatigue syndrome and with long COVID, everybody that I work with, I've been doing this for about a decade, and everybody that I work with always has all of those causes, all of the toxic five. So I actually don't test that much anymore because I know it's not a question of if they have those, it's a question of how much of each of those do they have, and we need to address them all anyway. So I'm going to move down a path where I'm going to address all of those. Now, with chronic pain, um, sometimes it's all of them, but sometimes it's part of them. So there's probably going to be some more testing that is going to need to kind of go into it to determine, do you have heavy metals? Do you have chemicals? Do you have molds? The infections largely can be done by symptoms, and then the trauma and the nervous system dysfunction is just going to be a process. If you've got chronic pain, if you have chronic fatigue, you've got nervous system dysfunction that needs to be remedied. So I think that there's some of those that require labs. Some of those can be done by symptoms.
Mm, yeah. And I suppose I wonder about this sometimes. It's hard to know chicken or egg, right? Um, if someone has had emotional trauma, then maybe they just don't deal with some of the other chemicals and these other exposures as well. And so then it
Absolutely.
could really be the secondary thing. And so yeah, do you have like a five-prong approach like when you're doing this, or is it you do one and then another, like how maybe we can talk about the actual how afterwards, but just first, like uh you said you kind of go by symptoms. So what are some can we look at the different ones and what some of the symptoms might be, Evan?
Absolutely. And I should say history and symptoms because history is
Yeah.
important. So, it's always important to take a history and to determine what sort of exposures have people had. So, when it comes to heavy metals, what sort of have they lived in a building built before 1970s, at least in the States, that had lead paint in it? Did they live next to a lead gasoline station? You know, have they eaten a lot of fish in their day, especially larger fish? Tuna fish. That was really my story, is that I pretty much had like a tuna fish sandwich almost every single day growing up, and that increased the amount of mercury in my body. And then I also had mercury fillings, right? Amalgams. And so we call these silver fillings because it sounds bad to call them mercury fillings, but they're actually half silver, half mercury. And every time you bite down, it releases mercury vapor into your mouth and then you swallow it, right? And so, does somebody have mercury fillings? So that's kind of lead and mercury. Cadmium has to do with smoke exposure. Did you get firsthand smoke exposure where you're smoking, or is it secondhand where somebody else was smoking? They're driving you around, a parent, an uncle, somebody, and the windows are up, and you're kind of breathing that stuff in for the majority of your childhood. So those are some of the heavy metals. And then with chemicals, it's like, okay, how much organic food are you eating? People who are more conscious, they're like, I eat organic all the time. Yeah, but you weren't eating organic in the 80s or the 70s or the 90s, right? And so there's a lot of pesticides and herbicides. Oftentimes people, when I ask them about, did somebody spray to get rid of weeds around your house every single year? They're like, yeah. And then I went out and I played in it. Or people talk about, how they grew up on a farm and they used to love to run behind the truck that was releasing all this vapor of some sort. They're like riding their bikes behind it. Well, those were pesticides, that were being produced to try to take care of the weeds that were in the fields, right? So you're getting faceful of all of these different toxins. So that's kind of heavy metals and the chemicals. And then in terms of the molds, about half of the buildings in first world country have water damage, and most of those have molds. So if somebody sees mold or smells mold or some sort of musty smell in a home that they've ever lived in, the likelihood that it had mold is very high, right? Because oftentimes when you see mold, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. So it's, once again, it's this accumulation because you could have had a mold exposure when you were 5 years of age and not had any mold exposure since then, but it's still in your body because you haven't done the things that you need to do because they're very specific to get the mold out of your body, right? And once again, it's this buildup, this total body burden where the immune system is then like, okay, I'm trying to deal with all this stuff and I can't deal with it, and then um, I get chronic pain because of the inflammation. So
Mm.
that's the mold. And then we can go into the infections where, there are some infections that actually have really significant symptoms, a conglomeration of symptoms that are diagnostic for those infections. So, for example, there's an infection that's called Borrelia, otherwise known as Lyme disease, can be found really any place in the world. We used to think it was just kind of like on the East Coast of the United States and Canada, but that's not true. It can really be found anywhere. And you really can't have it if you don't have two symptoms. So symptoms that come and go and symptoms that move around the body. And so this could be joint pain, muscle pain, or nerve pain that moves around the body. So 1 week or 1 month it's over here in your shoulder, and then the next week or the next month it's in your knee, right? So it's moving around the body, and then there's some days where it's there, and there's other days where it's gone. Okay, so that's Borrelia.
Is
Go
that
ahead.
because the little critters are moving around the body?
Yes, the little critters are moving around the body, absolutely.
So
And they're
gross.
manifesting in different parts of the body. So, if they're either in the joint or they're in the muscle, and then they're moving around to different parts. Yeah. And oftentimes it's usually the symptoms that we have is an indirect reaction to it. So it's not directly from the infection, it's from the immune system's response to the infection. So the immune system's trying to get rid of the infection, and in order to do that, it has to kind of go through cell walls and, and damage some of the internal processes that we kind of have, trying to get rid of this particular infection, and that ends up causing the inflammation and then consequently the pain and the dysfunction.
So the inflammation and pain dysfunctions are like collateral damage.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's Borrelia. And then Bartonella is an infection that's found in about upwards of 50% of all domestic animals, so cats and dogs. And so if you've ever been scratched or licked or bitten, by any of these animals, you can get this infection. And oftentimes it manifests as pain on the bottom of the feet, usually misdiagnosed as plantar fasciitis. A lot of people will be diagnosed with fibromyalgia or have a lot of muscle pain, or really tight muscles. Sometimes they have sleep issues. Sometimes there's some anxiety or some depression associated with it. And sometimes they're cold all the time. So it's usually, you don't have to have all those symptoms, but generally if you have like, oh, and I forgot cramps. So, if you have like pain in the bottom of the feet, muscle cramps, usually in the calves, usually at night, and a hard time sleeping, there's a high likelihood that you could have Bartonella. And then the last one I'll discuss is an infection called Babesia, where this is really considered the North American malaria because it makes you hot, makes you feel warm all the time, or a majority of the time. These are the people who, during winter, they love the weather and they're outside shoveling snow in a t-shirt and they feel great. And inside, they're always telling you that you need to turn up the AC. And you're like, what, are you kidding me? It's freezing in here. And they're like, no, it's still too hot. Oftentimes, they might have some shortness of breath or some sort of lung issue or cough, and their sleep is usually really bad, hard time falling asleep or staying asleep. And oftentimes, the mood issues that they have can be really bad. So, anxiety to the point of panic attacks, to the depression to the point of suicidal thoughts. You don't have to have, once again, all those symptoms, but if you have a couple of those, it can be significant for having babesia.
Hmm. And Evan, is there any like, are these sort of tied to geographical areas? Like, is there, some areas that are particularly bad for certain infections?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and oftentimes the answer is we don't know. I mean, there are the way that generally this is being tested is that they assess ticks, to see what infections are found when somebody finds a tick on themselves or whatever. They're then assessed. But the reality is that we can also get this from any insect that takes a blood meal. So it can be from mosquitoes, it can be from chiggers, it can be from biting flies, where there's going to be, transmission from one animal to another. Oftentimes it's coming from deer or any other animal, but you can also get it from mom through the placenta. So, moms dump all their good stuff and all their not so good stuff into their babies. And that's why sometimes some of the diseases that run in families we think are genetic, but sometimes they're actually because mom has transmitted some things to the child where they both have plantar fasciitis, and it happens to be the fact that they both have Bartonella, right? And we treat both people, and they get better. So sometimes it's from that. Sometimes it's from being intimate with somebody, kissing somebody, or being sexually intimate. You can get transmission there. If you've ever had a blood transfusion, you can get some of these as well. So they're really ubiquitous, and people are moving around the country. So, if, I grew up in New Jersey, and, there's a lot of ticks there. And then I moved to Ohio. I had some relationships with people. Who knows what I gave people, they gave me. I moved across the country, I traveled internationally. So it's like a lot of these things are being, transmitted all the time from person to person.
Yeah. one big world pot of soup. Um,
Indeed.
you
Yes.
know, I just kind of want to come back to it. Almost seems like there's no safe place, right? And all these things like go outside, spend time outdoors. And now it seems like, well, that might not be safe. Or have pets and you get their microbiome, but now you might be getting other stuff. So I like, uh, how can we make people feel a little bit more safe? Like not
Yeah,
feel like
I'm
the
glad
world
you
is a dangerous place.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because the world is a safe place, right? And this is part of the work that you do, right? It's really important for your nervous system to know that you are safe and that the world is a safe place. And all this stuff that I'm talking about, you have to keep at arm's length and you have to understand it intellectually, but not take it on, right? And
Yeah.
so these are just things that are going on. It's like the news, right? Really shouldn't be paying attention to the news. You understand that there are things that are happening out there, and you need somebody in your life who's going to tell you if there's really crazy things happening, right? But the reality is that you have to continually remind yourself that the world is a safe place and you are safe, right? And this is all just stuff that we need to understand intellectually, and then we can address if we need to address them, but it doesn't mean anything beyond, hey, this is a potential cause that I have for my symptoms that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're talking about that because, if we start feeling stressed and nervous, well then our body can't deal with all this stuff as well, because our bodies can handle a lot. I mean, is it possible for people to have exposure to some of these things and their body does deal with it and they don't have any symptoms or the symptoms go away? Does that or
Absolutely.
do you or maybe you don't know because you don't see those people.
No, well, yeah, I mean, I don't see those people, but it's still definitely very possible. If your immune system is functioning well and you're able to detoxify well on a regular basis, you're drinking lots of water, eating good food, getting good sleep, getting good movement, the likelihood that you're going to get these is potentially going to be less. And the work that you do with retraining the nervous system and addressing people's trauma is really essential because I've seen people who have heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, like all this stuff. And then they go off and they do a trauma retraining program and they're like 90% better. Right. So, in general, what I see is that, to get 100% better, you got to address all of them, but you can get so much better by addressing the nervous system. And so it really is this interplay between the nervous system and the immune system and all the other systems in the body that are causing you to not feel well. When you address your nervous system, you're going to feel so much better.
We are beautifully complicated creatures. um, let's talk a little bit. I know that you help people with long COVID, and now we're kind of seeing because it's 2024 and all this happened in 2020 and beyond. So now we're seeing people with these long symptoms that have been lingering. What what's happening with that, and I know chronic pain can be part of those symptoms as well. What are you seeing with that and how do you deal with that?
So, for those who aren't familiar, long COVID is basically a COVID infection with symptoms that have persisted.
Okay.
So, really, anything since 2020, if you have had any chronic fatigue, chronic pain, weird symptoms that have popped up, you have to include COVID in the differential and you have to look at long COVID because the spike protein, which comes from the virus, has been found in every single cell in the body. Okay. And so when it's found in every cell in the body, then and the immune system's job is to really get rid of things out of the body that aren't supposed to be there. And like we talked about, the immune system's response to something ends up increasing inflammation and causing pain and dysfunction. We have to then take that spike protein into account. So if you have spike protein in your muscles, and your immune system is going after it, and you have inflammation in your muscles, you're going to have pain in your muscles. If it's in the joints, you're going to have pain in your joints, right? And it's complicated by the fact that a lot of the reason why COVID persists is because people already had the toxic five. So they had the heavy metals and the chemicals and the molds and the infections and the trauma or nervous system dysfunction already in their bodies. And so that allowed the COVID to come in and to take hold. The immune system was distracted. It couldn't fight off the COVID, right? So, and according to the stats, we're seeing anywhere between like 10 and 40% of people who get COVID end up with persistent symptoms of COVID. And sometimes it's really sinister. And you're like, okay, so now I have brain fog. I had a viral illness maybe about 6 months ago. My brain fog is worse since then. Is that viral illness, was it COVID? And is this brain fog that I'm experiencing from that? And you have to consider it. And there are ways to address it. So
And
yeah.
how would someone know whether the pain that they're experiencing is who knows what kind of pain, or if it was being caused by that coronavirus?
So it's hard to know because there's really no good test to determine whether or not the virus is still persistent in your body. So generally we have to, and pretty typical. I mean, oftentimes people will know, I had this viral illness and then I got this symptom.
Right.
So, and when I ask them, and they'll say it wasn't COVID. Well, the testing sucks, unfortunately, excuse my French. And so, even if you did not test positive for COVID, you still have to consider it. So, when I'm always asking people on my questionnaire, I say, since 2020 or since November 2019, how many viral illnesses have you had? And have you felt worse after any of these viral illnesses? Now you can feel worse right afterwards, or sometimes your symptoms go away and then maybe a month later you feel worse, or sometimes even 6 months later, all of a sudden you'll start to get weird symptoms. So you have to keep it in the back of your mind, and it's something that I ask everybody.
That's that's interesting how I'm just thinking, when I was doing my functional medicine coaching training, we talked about the timeline, right? And really getting a person's whole history, which you do. But now, like, there's this other element that you've got to consider there now with since 2020. And I mean, most people I think now probably have experienced COVID. I mean, I would think I haven't seen any stats on that, like what percentage have not had it. But
Right.
I
Yeah,
went
I
a
think it's like 99.9% or something like that.
yeah, I was 3 years before. I only got it last about a year ago for the first time. So, but yeah, I mean, almost everyone you talk to has had it or had it multiple times now. Um, so you get quite a. I can't imagine how long is your intake form,
It's pretty long.
right? Because
Takes
you
people
got
about an hour or two to go through.
yeah, because you're really I love the way that you do that, Evan, that you're like building from the history and from the symptoms instead of saying, come and see me and let's do $10,000 worth of testing to figure things out. Um, do you still do some testing at all, or is that not part of your protocol?
I do, but I do much less. I do about $500 worth of testing. So that's an EMA test. It's basically a mold test to look at spores and mycotoxins in your home to make sure you're not living in mold, because that's one of those things where it's hard to get people well when they're living in mold.
Right.
And the other test is looking at things like B12 and thyroid and vitamin D and adrenals. So it's like a blood test that costs a couple $100. So it's really not that much in terms
Mm-hmm.
of what I ask people to do when it comes to laboratory tests.
Mm-hmm. And I know we're going to talk about, get a little bit deeper into how to deal with some of these, but I'm just wondering. I love asking, what if someone was just going to do something themselves? Like, what's something they could do for themselves that's going to start to take them to, a healing place as opposed to on the trajectory of getting worse.
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of things that people can do, by themselves. I mean, the first thing is to work on their nervous system. So whether they're working with you or a trauma program, or whether they're doing, we have a mindset component in our program where we talk about gratitudes, visualizations, envisioning yourself healthy, envisioning what your ideal day looks like, looking at any limiting beliefs you have and flipping them into empowering beliefs or affirmations, looking at any disempowering questions that you're asking yourself, like, why is this happening to me? Why do I feel like crap? The brain is a goal achieving machine, and it is going to give you an answer to any question that you ask it. So you need to ask it a better question, like, how can I love myself more today? Right? How can I love my partner more today? What can I do today to move my health forward? Just, even a baby step. So I would say if I had to choose one thing, it would be like gratitudes. 3 gratitudes a day is what the research shows to significantly alter your mood for the better. And then there's all the lifestyle habits. So, drinking 3 liters of water a day, it's kind of amazing what happens when people actually get hydrated. And generally, when you're doing like a detox going through our programs, you really need 3 liters of water a day. So most people could probably do 2.5, but 3 liters oftentimes is really supportive for folks. Eating the right foods or basically avoiding the wrong foods. So I tell people eat meat and vegetables for the most part. That's what I see most people get well with, but it's avoiding gluten and dairy and sugar and alcohol and processed foods. Those are kind of the big ones that I see causing the most amount of inflammation. And then there's movement, making sure people are getting the Goldilocks dose of movement. So this is kind of what's ideal for them. Now, a lot of the people that I see who have chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, they're really exhausted,
Yeah.
and we want them to only do as much exercise or movement as they can do without making them feel worse. When you feel worse with movement, it's called post exertional malaise, and we don't want that. That's going to be stressful on the body. So figuring out how much exercise or movement that you can do without feeling worse. And if you're looking for something that's kind of short and fun, because oftentimes move it has to be fun, it's like put on your favorite song to dance to and then dance for 3 minutes. You'll get your heart rate up, and that can be a really nice way to get some good movement. And then the last thing is getting good sleep.
Yeah.
So making sure 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, closer to 9, the better, believe it or not. Making sure that there's no animals that are waking you up in the middle of the night. If somebody's snoring, you've got good earplugs or you're sleeping in another room. Like sleep is precious. You got to make sure you protect it.
Gosh, I mean, they're so simple, right? But makes sense. I want to ask you a question about the water because that's one of the first things I talk about too. Do you recommend like putting any salt or anything like that in the water? What are your thoughts on that?
For most of the people, well, actually, for 100% of the people in my program who have adrenal gland dysfunction, whose part of its job is to produce something called aldosterone that manages the salt balance in the body. When the adrenals are compromised because of these toxins and you have chronic fatigue and you have stress, then consequently they can't manage the salt balance appropriately. So I do recommend for most people to take as much salt in their water as they can tolerate. And so that means if you get swollen or if you get a headache, it's too much salt. So usually I tell people to start off with like a half a teaspoon per 20 ounces of water. And the water, we want it to be as pure as possible. If you go to ewg.org/tap water, TAPWATER, at least in the States, you can look and see, you put in your zip code, you can see how toxic your water is. So getting a good water filter like an Aquasana can be an inexpensive way to make sure your water is higher quality. But coming back to the question, yes, adding in that sea salt and just making sure that you're not getting swollen or getting a headache. Or if it tastes like crap, it's too much water if you feel like you're drinking out of the ocean. But for some people, they're like, wow, this water tastes so good. And as you get better, you require less water. Sorry, less salt.
Right.
And so consequently, you start to wean down off of your salt as your adrenals start to get better.
Mm. Okay, so the type of salt matters, right? You're talking like natural sea salt, or what about Himalayan salt?
Yeah, Himalayan is great. It's higher in potassium, which oftentimes gets depleted when people have adrenal issues. Celtic salt is higher in calcium. Um, Yeah, so any sort of sea salt is generally fine. You just don't want table salt. NaCl is actually pro-inflammatory, but when you're doing sea salt and people are like, "Oh, my cardiologist, my heart doctor said that I shouldn't be taking sea salt or I shouldn't be taking salt," they're actually not talking about sea salt
Right.
because the sea salt has potassium and magnesium in it, which have both been shown to lower blood pressure, actually, and provide protection for the heart. But if you're just taking table salt, that is the issue. That is the problem that they're trying to avoid.
Right. Okay. That's a great tip. And I don't think I've ever had anyone talking about that before. So thank you for that. Now we are going to get a little bit more in depth on, we're going to extend our conversation to talk about how to deal with these. But to tune into that or to hear that, you've got to tune into my Becoming Pain Free Summit, which is coming up November 4th to 10th. So you can hear that there then. But for now, Evan, where is the best place for people to find you? How would they work with you?
So I'm at energymdmethod.com, and there's a little button in the bottom right-hand corner, little uh, chat bubble that you can click on, and that'll come directly to me and my team. And so if you have a question, you want to start a conversation, that's a great way to do it. And then I do offer free 20-minute calls to see if I can help you. That's always an important question that I want answered, that I'm sure that other people do as well. And we've got one-on-one programs, group programs, and online communities. So we have programs for almost every budget so that we can help people. And our mission is to help 1 million people resolve their chronic fatigue and long COVID naturally.
Wonderful. And you work with people, can they be anywhere in the world or it doesn't
Yes, so
fall
I have
on?
I've got 100% virtual practice. So it's just over Zoom. And so we have about 10% of our people are international. Um, and so, yeah, we can work with people all over the world, and we have supplement stores and lab stores in different parts of the world to get people the tools that they need as well.
Wonderful. Evan, thanks so much for being a guest on the podcast today. And I'm looking forward to the rest of our conversation on the Becoming Pain Free Summit. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. See you later, everyone.